A second wave of the floods have formed on the upper reaches of the Yangtze River, and it's already impacting the Three Gorges Dam. The Chinese Communist Party has placed the capital city of Xinjiang under a wartime state to allegedly contain a new outbreak of the virus. And July 20th marks 21 years since the Chinese Communist Party launched its persecution against Falun Gong. We speak with Levi Brody, Executive Director of the Falun Dafa Information Center. Welcome back, everyone. First off in the news, the second wave of the floods on the Yangtze River formed in its upper reaches on July 17th. And this next wave, these floods come in waves, is expected to bring worse floods than the first. It's already impacting the Three Gorges Dam, and the flood discharge from the dam has intensified flooding in the middle and lower reaches of the Yangtze River. There are already 16 hydrological stations in the Dongting Lake area that have exceeded water levels, and 81 embankments have also exceeded their warning levels. Now, along the Yangtze River, the Qinhuai River in Jiangsu and the Chaohu Lake in Anhui have exceeded their highest water levels in history. Heavy rains in Luan and Jinzhai in Anhui caused flash floods, and many roads were flooded. On July 18th, the two-way tunnel of the Jinzhai high-speed rail line collapsed. And amidst all of this, on July 19th, with the inflow of water reaching unmanageable levels, authorities blasted a dam for emergency discharge in Anhui province. And in Wuwei city of Anhui, which is on the northern bank of the lower reaches of the Yangtze River, many dikes have already collapsed. On July 19th, local authorities announced that an area of 3,000 acres near this embankment should be immediately evacuated. State media, meanwhile, are claiming that displacement, seepage, and deformation measures at the Three Gorges Dam are within the normal range. But this also marked the first time that state media have admitted that displacement, seepage, and deformation were actually taking place at the Three Gorges Dam. And so a bit more on this. The CCP has been mostly silent about issues with the Three Gorges Dam. An important point to note, they had to open up the floodgates of the Three Gorges Dam, and reports suggest they've opened up every floodgate on the dam. If they were to not do that, the dam risks collapse. And when they did open these floodgates, it ended up flooding every place downstream. Chinese authorities, allegedly, according to reports, did not even warn people ahead of time when they did that, which meant many people within the path of the flood ended up dying in their sleep because they drowned or did not turn off their electricity and were electrocuted. There were reports of this. Now, the Chinese Communist Party is admitting that these issues are taking place at the Three Gorges Dam, but they're claiming that they have it within manageable levels. Now, whether or not that is the case, whether they can manage it, is yet to be seen. The Chinese Communist Party has not been reliable with claims like this in the past. And when it comes to the Chinese Communist Party itself, why would they not warn people ahead of time when they're opening up all the floodgates? Very likely they did not want to have the international media know that these floods were taking place in the first place. You might notice a lot of mainstream media have been pretty quiet about these floods until at least very recently. And when it comes to the opening of the Three Gorges Dam, which again flooded people downstream, normally within normal government functions, you would think it would be the responsible thing for them to go and warn the people, at least in my analysis. The Chinese Communist Party did not do that until afterwards, so what would be the logic of them doing that? Well, one is to save face, you could say. They want to make it look like they have the situation under control. They also don't want to make the Three Gorges Dam look bad, because the CCP's reputation is actually closely tied to the Three Gorges Dam. The Chinese Communist Party has used it in a lot of its propaganda, especially early on when it first built it. It's one of the pride creations of the CCP. And so admitting that there are issues at the Three Gorges Dam, admitting that the dam cannot hold the floods back, which was the issue which led them to open up these floodgates, well, that would be showing vulnerability for the party. And related to the Three Gorges Dam, the late Huang Wanli, a well-known water engineer in China and a former professor at the Tsinghua University, predicted that the dam would have 12 catastrophic incidents based on his research. So far, 11 of his 12 predictions have come true. Now, these predictions included that the lower reaches of the Yangtze River bank would collapse, that water quality would degrade, that it would generate insufficient power, that upstream floods would grow worse, and among other things. His only prediction that has not yet come true is that the dam itself would collapse. Now, in other news, the Epoch Times obtained internal documents from China that reveal the Chinese Communist Party upgraded its Golden Shield project. This is used to censor and control the internet under the Great Firewall. Now, as part of this program, using the banner of safety construction or social governance modernization, the Public Security Department has placed 96% of China's population in the public security database of its national surveillance system. So again, part of the censorship system, the way they monitor and censor the entire Chinese internet, also has a surveillance element built into it. And we're seeing now a large portion, about 96% of the Chinese population, is in that database currently. Now for some broader stories for the day. First off, in Xinjiang, and some news related to the new coronavirus, the CCP virus. The Chinese Communist Party has placed the capital city of Xinjiang, which is Urumqi, under a, quote, wartime state to allegedly contain the virus. Now, official reports claim that by July 18th, there have been 17 confirmed virus cases and 23 asymptomatic cases. But taking that, in context, the Chinese Communist Party has not been reliable with numbers in the past. Now, Xinjiang is home to many of China's Muslim Uyghurs, who are badly persecuted by the CCP. The city of Urumqi has a population of around 3.5 million people as well. And on July 16th, the city's metro was closed, and Chinese state media reported that local authorities put different protocols in place. These included, among other things, as the Epoch Times reports, quote, local officials should seal off their communities and provide delivery of daily necessities to those who are sick. Local public transportation should greatly be reduced. Local markets and hotels should not be kept open for business. And travelers arriving in Urumqi should be placed under quarantine for 7 days upon arrival. Now, original reporting from the Epoch Times suggests the virus situation may be worse there than what authorities are claiming. This included a leaked emergency notice from a community in Urumqi with an unknown date, showing the virus may have already spread widely in the city, and included directives to authorities to question people who had traveled to set locations. These included 3 different districts, a theater, a pub, and a ballroom. Also, a video from July 16th shows a large crowd lined up outside of a hospital in Urumqi, and a staffer at the People's Hospital in Xinjiang in Urumqi said in an interview that 3,000 to 4,000 people were being tested for the virus each day. Now, taking this in broader context, lockdowns in Xinjiang could suggest that this is the CCP using these lockdowns as a way to further its persecution of these Muslim Uyghurs in that area. This is what they're being accused of doing right now in Hong Kong, for example. Now, the Chinese Communist Party has several different lockdowns in place, allegedly for the virus, in different parts of China. Now we have Urumqi in Xinjiang, also Hong Kong, and also Beijing. Now in Hong Kong, the CCP is being accused of using these lockdowns to basically forbid protest against its new national security laws. This may be the case in Xinjiang as well. But at the same time, original reporting from the Epoch Times does suggest that the situation may be serious there in Xinjiang, and the new outbreaks overall in China again also appear to be worse than what the CCP is claiming. It does seem that in some areas, Beijing for example, Xinjiang for example, the virus situation is even worse than what the CCP is saying. This is based on the ground interviews, different interviews with individuals at the hospitals, and also videos that have come out. The Chinese Communist Party may not be fully upfront with the true situation of the virus. That said, again, there are areas such as in Hong Kong where the CCP appears to be using this strategically. So there are 2 different angles on this to keep in mind. A human rights group against the CCP's persecution of Christians is calling on Attorney General William Barr to designate the Chinese Communist Party as a transnational criminal organization. Now, the group called the Save the Persecuted Christians Coalition has launched a petition and issued an open letter that details the various campaigns of abuse, threats, and theft that the CCP operates. It says, quote, the evidence of the CCP's global criminality is overwhelming and proliferating throughout the United States. The CCP's lethality and criminal sophistication demonstrates that this lawless CCP poses a clear and present danger to the health, security, and prosperity of America. And in other news, the United States has designated 5 Chinese foreign nationals and 2 Chinese companies under the Foreign Narcotics Kingpin Designation Act for their involvement in international drug trafficking operations around synthetic opium, these drugs killing many youth on our streets. A statement from Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says this, quote, today's action is part of a continued whole-of-government effort to crack down on fentanyl and other synthetic opioids trafficked from China that have claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of Americans. Now, some broader context to this, the Chinese Communist Party is deeply involved in the drug war in the United States. They are the main suppliers of these synthetic drugs, including fentanyl, that are found on U.S. streets. And it's also the main supplier of precursor chemicals that are used by different drug cartels and organizations to manufacture things like methamphetamines. Now, the Chinese Communist Party does this openly. In their own doctrine, they call this drug warfare. They describe this, for example, in their unrestricted warfare doctrine. Drug warfare, its purpose, it's a few different dimensions to it. One is to finance the CCP's different operations, and it was started under Mao Zedong, for example. There's a great book on this, Red Cocaine by Joseph Douglas. It details how different communist states used drugs to finance their different radical movements around the world. One of the main people involved in this was Mao Zedong, who took lessons from the British Opium Wars to use opium, for example, in the opium trade and other drug trades to finance the CCP's different international movements. And also this had other purposes, for example, destroying the moral fabric of societies, weakening targeted countries, financing criminal operations in those countries, and undermining these governments and countries in different ways. Now on this, the Epoch Times previously exposed these operations back in 2015, and the articles on this were heavily cited at that time, including in official reports from the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. Now, in other news, the Epoch Times received leaked documents from one of China's censorship authorities that detail terms related to Chinese Communist Party leader Xi Jinping that they deem sensitive. Now, the Epoch Times has published this list in full, and it includes 35,476 sensitive words just about Xi Jinping. And so what does this show? Well, in China, many of the netizens, the people who use the internet and discuss on the internet in China, they know that the internet is censored. They know certain keywords are censored. And so they have many ways of getting around this censorship. One of them, for example, is using words that sound similar to the words they're trying to use. Other words are using joke words that relate to the person they're trying to talk about, for example, Xi Jinping. And when it comes to this latest finding, this shows that the Chinese Communist Party is tracking all of these different terms. And this massive list of terms, more than 35,000, just in references to Xi Jinping, demonstrate how extensive the censorship is. Now, meanwhile, it was 21 years ago, on July 20th, 1999, that the Chinese Communist Party launched its persecution against Falun Gong. Cases of persecution and death are continuing. Between January and May just this year, 27 practitioners of Falun Gong were confirmed to have been killed by CCP authorities, although complete data on the human rights abuses and the number of dead are not fully public. Now, among those known to have been killed by the CCP recently was Wang Shukun, a therapeutic doctor at Hailin Township Hospital in Hailin City, and she refused to renounce her beliefs and was killed because of it. Now, according to the Epoch Times, her husband said that in June she was abducted by the CCP's police at the hospital where she worked, and they severely beat her for several hours. When she came home, she was covered in bruises and one of her knees was broken. And soon after, on July 1st, she suffered symptoms of a stroke and hemorrhage which killed her. Her husband said he cried before her body was cremated and said, quote, "My wife is innocent. My wife died of injustice." Now, many leaders around the world have openly condemned the Chinese Communist Party's persecution against Falun Gong, including in the United States, the UK, and elsewhere. Now, in Canada, just recently, a group of current and former parliamentarians and human rights activists are calling for the Canadian government to sanction 14 Chinese officials under the Magnitsky Act who are responsible for the persecution of Falun Gong. Now, one of these MPs, James Bezin, said this according to Epoch Times, quote, "Canada must use this legislation to sanction the communist government officials who are committing the gross human rights violations of imprisonment, organ harvesting, and murder of Falun Gong members." The Falun Dafa Association of Canada said in a statement, quote, "The list of 14 Chinese officials includes former CCP leader Jiang Zemin, the main perpetrator and architect of the persecution, who sought to eradicate Falun Gong because of its popularity and the group's refusal to surrender to CCP control." Now, for some deeper insights into this, we have here with us Levi Brody. He's the executive director of the Falun Dafa Information Center, which is a human rights organization. So, Levi, thanks for being on Crossroads.
Thank you very much for having me. Enjoy the program a lot.
So, first off, what's the significance of July 20?
Well, July 20th is a very solemn anniversary for us. That is basically the day, in fact, in the middle of the night, in the early morning hours of July 20th, when the Chinese Communist Party went out and they started pulling out Falun Gong volunteers around the country out of their beds, out of their homes, putting them to prison. And that's really when they started nationwide the official suppression of Falun Gong. It wasn't until 2 days later where they actually made some announcements about what they were doing. But in terms of people being abducted on a large scale and being put into prison and detention camps, July 20th was the day that started it all.
Now, how would you describe what Falun Gong is?
Falun Gong is a Buddhist-based spiritual practice that is centered around truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. To practice Falun Gong really means to do three things: to do a sitting meditation, slow motion exercises that look a little bit like Tai Chi, and to study moral teachings, again, that are based around the principle of truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. Now, Falun Gong has a very ancient lineage, but it was only first introduced in China in 1992. And in just 7 years, according to Chinese state-run media, there were 100 million people practicing, which is an enormous amount of people. And it was really from all walks of life. In all the provinces, you had government leaders, military people, homemakers, farmers, students. It was very much something that swept the heartland of China. And since then, of course, it's been practiced. It is now practiced by people in over 80 countries around the world. But it really started in China in 1992.
Now, I know a lot of news outlets have reported the CCP regards it as a cult. What would you say to someone who has this understanding?
It's a very calculated weapon, and I think there's some interesting things to note about that. The first thing that's interesting is when this persecution started in July. I guess the Communist Party leadership was not used to explaining themselves to the world. They had no rationale for this. In fact, if you go back in July of 1999 on Nightline, a spokesman for Falun Gong and a Chinese Communist Party official was brought onto the show, and they asked him point blank, "Why are you doing this?" And the guy was kind of moving in his chair, and I think the best he could come up with is they're disturbing social order and disrupting traffic. Right? This is why we're detaining hundreds of thousands of people. So for many months, they really didn't have an answer. It wasn't until October of that year, months after the persecution had started, that they had come up with the idea of, let's label Falun Gong a cult, and that will help explain why we're doing this. And it would also detract would-be supporters of human rights outside of China. And indeed, that really has been the effect. They've been pushing this cult line for years and years and years. And, if you say a lie enough times, eventually it starts to stick. And that's really kind of what we're seeing. Now, of course, there have been some academics and some human rights groups that have looked very closely at the definition of cult. And the conclusion was obvious. Falun Gong is not that. In fact, it's the very opposite of cult. People who practice Falun Gong tell stories about helping them bridge the gap between family members, helping bring their communities together. There's no membership, for example, with Falun Gong. There's no fees or dues or organization to sign up for. So it's really, in reality, the opposite of a cult. But cult was the most damaging label the Communist Party could find to explain what they were doing. And they've been pushing that for 21 years.
Now, why did the CCP decide to persecute it?
The persecution of Falun Gong was really a perfect storm of three factors. One was size. There were 100 million people practicing Falun Gong in China. That's 1 out of every 13 people. And a few leaders in the Communist Party saw that size and they got nervous. That's more than the members of the Communist Party itself. The second reason was Falun Gong was really much from traditional Chinese culture. And the ruling Communist Party had just spent decades trying to stamp out traditional Chinese culture. So ideologically, it was something they'd been trying to eradicate for years. And here comes something that really swept through the country and people were really taking it to heart. So ideologically, there was a concern with a few leaders. However, the third reason is really the driving reason, and it's perhaps maybe the most tragic reason. The leader of the Communist Party at that time, Jiang Zemin, was really the first leader to take over China that didn't go through the revolution, and he lacked credibility, and he was desperate to build up a legacy. So here he is in the 1990s trying to build up his own legacy, and along comes Falun Gong. And it sort of just sweeps through China. it's gaining all kinds of respect and acknowledgement and essentially steals Zhang's thunder. And that was really the tipping point, because Zhang himself was the one who said, we need to stamp out Falun Gong. And after a little bit of a power struggle there, because even members of the Politburo didn't want to do this, at the end of that power struggle, Zhang prevailed and the persecution went forward.
Now, what's the scale of the persecution and how serious is it?
This is probably, I would say, one of the most misunderstood aspects of the persecution of Falun Gong, because you have to go back, and I think the most important thing to do, to start with at least, is to look at the number, and that is any of the estimates that you saw in 1999, and these were quoted in the New York Times, Associated Press, again, the Chinese state-run media was saying this, is saying there's anywhere from 70 on the low end to over 100 million people practicing. Again, 1 out of every 13 people. So think about, what does it take in terms of your police force, your security apparatus, your judicial apparatus? What does it take to persecute 1 out of 13 people in your country? And again, we're talking about Falun Gong is found in every walk of life, in every single province. Essentially, what Jiang Zemin's mandate turned into is a weaponization of a lot of these structures. It's really criminalizing all these institutions. And you see that effects actually today, because a lot of what you're seeing in terms of the tactics that they're using on the House Christians and the Uyghurs, many of those tactics were developed and refined on persecuting Falun Gong. So the impact of what's happened to Falun Gong goes way beyond the community of Falun Gong itself.
Great. Levi, again, really appreciate being on the show. Appreciate it.
Thanks very much for having me, Josh.
Yeah, thank you. Now, folks, the Epoch Times has published a special series called The Specter of Communism is Ruling Our World. It goes into the history of communism, the crimes of communism, and the different ways it has manifested in every country. We now have a special video series on this, which will be airing here on this channel, 12 p.m. Eastern Time starting today, July 20th. We're going to be showing 1 episode a day for 18 days, so be sure to check them out. Now, that said, folks, again, we're broadcasting Monday through Friday, 5 days a week, so be sure to tune in. Also, we do have a Patreon if you want to help support this channel. And for our Patreon supporters, every Sunday, I'll be doing a live Q&A, so be sure to tune in for that as well. Of course, folks, if you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It really, really helps this channel. If you want to go the extra mile, please tell a friend or family member about it. Again, really appreciate the support. And with that said, folks, again, please take care of yourselves, stay healthy, and stay free.